Hello, everyone. My name is Abdulrazak Takriti, and I'm currently serving as the Mahmoud Darwish Visiting Professor in Palestinian Studies here at Brown University. This exciting chair was established precisely for the reasons that we're meeting here for today, which is to encourage discussion on the most difficult issues affecting Palestine, issues that have a certain persistence to them, that carry a lot of pain with them, but that also require serious, sober discussion, illumination, and reflection. In presenting today's topic, which is the siege of Gaza, the longest siege in modern history, we were very cognizant that this is the 15th year in which this siege for which the siege has lasted. During these 15 years, the people of Gaza have not been able to freely move. They've not been able to carry out their daily lives normally. They've not been able to import or export goods and services. They've been divided from their families. And they've been divided from the rest of the Palestinian people as well, physically at least, if not politically and emotionally. So we have a very difficult situation at hand, and I cannot think of a better panel to address it than this panel. All the participants on this panel are either from Gaza or know Gaza very well. And they are all leading experts in their respective fields. And it is a true honor to be able to present them to you today and to hear from them today. So we're going to start with Aya Al-Ghazzawi. Aya is joining us from Gaza, of course, and the electricity situation there is always sketchy, to say the least. The internet situation is difficult as well. And that's why whenever we have a panel on Gaza, we always start it by the discussion on should we let the people there go first, because we worry that the electricity might get cut or the internet might get cut. And this, in the case of this panel, this was no exception, which is a reflection of how difficult the situation on the ground in that essential part of Palestine. So Aya received her bachelor's degree in English language and literature from Al-Aqsa University in Gaza, Palestine. She is an English language teacher in the Palestinian Ministry of Education. She is also a boycott, divestment, sanctions activist, a member of the One Democratic State campaign, and the writer for We Are Not Numbers, as well as several other websites, including Open Democracy and Amnesty blogs. Most recently, Aya served as the 2021 Gaza mentee at Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. So it's a great honor to welcome you here, Aya, and we look forward to hearing from you about the situation on the ground.
Thank you very much. Actually, it's my honor to be with you today. And thank you very much for Dr. Abdulrazak Takriti for reaching out to me and coordinating this. The first time he contacted me was in the Israeli aggression on Gaza in 2021. And he invited me to talk in an event hosted by the Arab Studies Center in Houston University. During that aggression, Israel killed 253 people, including 66 children and 35 women. And here I am again talking to you only a couple of months after another Israeli aggression in August on Gaza as well, in which Israel killed 49 people, including 19 children and 4 women. Obviously, since we are having this event now, little has changed. Israel's violence against Palestinians hasn't wavered, certainly not in Gaza. In fact, if you ask me how old I am, I would say that I am 5 major Israeli Christians and 25 years old, 15 of which I spent under siege. So it aches my heart that we are still in 2022, yet we Palestinians are still subjected to Israel's colonial violence and apartheid system. As for Gaza, life is gloomy to the vast majority of us here. Israel imposed this hermetic medieval siege on Gaza in 2006 as a form of collective punishment in a blatant violation of international law. Ever since, everything has drastically deteriorated. The restriction on movement, economy, healthcare system, and so many other things. For example, out of the 7 crossings Gaza has, Israel controls 6 of them, while the Egyptian authorities control the 7th, which is known as the Rafah crossing. And this fact resulted in a severe restriction on movement. Students lost their scholarships due to crossing closures and unstable political status. Food has been calculated by the Israeli occupation. Raw material that is necessary for industries has been prohibited. Patients died while waiting for permits issued by Israel, and only 28% of the medical permits needed for exit requests to receive medical treatment outside Gaza through areas crossing was approved at the beginning of 2020, compared to 97% in 2005. In addition, it takes 23 working days to review exit permit requests by individuals to receive treatment outside Gaza through areas crossing. The restriction on crossings also included fuel, which led to frequent power blackouts in Gaza, as everybody knows, and pushed hospitals to postpone non-emergency surgeries, which has lengthened the waiting period for patients. Also, the fuel shortage caused pumping 100 million liters of untreated sewage into our beach, contaminating the only resort for Gazans here. Moreover, the economy in Gaza has collapsed. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development issued a report that said the economic cost of the Israeli occupation on the Gaza Strip during the past decade was estimated at $16.7 billion. And according to the Federation of the Trade Unions in the Gaza Strip, about 160,000 workers lost their jobs or stopped working temporarily due to the closure. Besides, Palestinian workers from Gaza have been denied entry to work inside the Green Line until recently. Many industries have closed, and unemployment rate has risen to 70% among youth. The average daily wage for workers inside the Gaza Strip is equivalent to $3 per day, of course, with long hours of work. And that is never enough to cope with the harsh reality that we live. Many of our youth drop out of school because parents cannot afford paying for universities, and most of them reach their mid-30s without being able to get married. It's a well-established fact that the UN said in its reports that Gaza would be uninhabitable by 2020. Now we are in 2022, and Gaza is still unlivable, with 2,300,000 people crammed in 360 square kilometers area. 70% of the population here are refugees, including myself, and 80% of the population are dependent on international aid, as 56% of them are under poverty line. So everything actually in Gaza pushes our youngsters to risk their lives to immigrate in pursuit of a better, dignified future. And they literally go through hell to leave, while many die before they even reach their destination. I would tell you a personal story that includes my brother. My brother has been away for 4 years in Algeria. He's studying his bachelor degree. And he just visited us for 2 months during the summer holiday. He stayed on the way to Gaza for a couple of days, and it was a really tough time for him. And even when he wanted to leave Gaza, because he feared to skip, the flight date, he had to leave 5 days earlier because he would know that he would be stuck, through the Rafah crossing, which is between Gaza and Palestine and Egypt. And it was so much a miserable experience for him. He almost swore not to come here again. And so this is a really personal story that almost all Palestinians share. Of course, the very lucky people who managed to leave the Gaza Strip. And that leaves us with a question. So what can we do? Can we just leave Gaza suffering from all these things and being subjected to Israeli violence, Israeli aggressions, more restriction on movement, insecure food, the health system is completely depleted. So what to do? I would suggest a couple of things. First, I would call for not paying the US taxes to Israel, because as we know, the US is the biggest ally for Israel, and it helps Israel with $3.8 billion each year. That ends, of course, in buying more weapons, more ammunition by Israel, and as a result, these weapons against us, on our bodies here in Gaza. So Gaza is basically deemed as a testing field for Israel. I would also suggest that you call upon your governors to sever all ties with Israel and adopt the BDS goal, which is the boycott, divestment, sanctions call, to stop Israel from perpetrating war crimes and from violating the humanitarian law and international law. Israel must be stopped. Israel must be boycotted, sanctions, and also isolated until it ends all its war crimes. Moreover, I would also advise to share our Palestinian stories that have been written by our writers, especially by We Are Not Numbers. And one more thing, as a person who is a member in the One Democratic State campaign, I would love to say that the two-state solution, as other people refer to, is not really a good one, because it's racist in scores. It's not only cannot be implemented, but it deprives Palestinians of their basic rights, which are freedom, justice, and equality. And without achieving these rights, we cannot call it a peaceful justice solution. So the most suitable solution, in my opinion, is the One Democratic State campaign, a democratic state for all its people, whether for Palestinians or non-Zionist people. So that was my contribution. I'm waiting for you for your, of course, Richie comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aya, for sharing with us some of the stories on the ground. And really, I wanted to open with your presentation, because often the situation in Gaza is reduced to abstract concepts. What generally takes place is an erasure of the people and their experiences. And we get into an endless cycle of rhetorical conceits that are used to cover up what is going on the ground, which is a siege of a large population concentrated in a very tiny territory that was cut off from its surroundings in the 1948 Nakba. It was forcibly cut off from the rest of historic Palestine. It was forcibly subjected to a situation of serious ethnic cleansing, whereby it had to absorb people from across southern Palestine, giving them a refuge and shelter. And it ended up becoming a playground for Israeli military forces. They keep bombing it on a regular basis. So the rhetorical conceits that are used are generally connected to the nature of the political party that won the Palestinian elections in 2007 and ended up coming to power in Gaza afterwards. But we never justify the bombing, siege, and destruction of countries based on the results of an election. If that were the criteria, then people in the United States should apply it to the Israeli state, for example, and many other parts of the world. The situation is intolerable, and I think that to put it in context, we have with us Jihad Abu Salim, who is also from Gaza, who also knows it very well, but who is familiar with the history of it because he's a PhD candidate at History and Hebrew and Judaic Studies, the joint program at New York University in those fields. His research examines Arab intellectual writings on Zionism from the first half of the 20th century. Jihad also studies the social and political history of the Gaza Strip, focusing on the impact of the Nakba on life in Palestine's Gaza district and 1950s political life in the Gaza Strip, which was, of course, very, very vibrant. He earned his bachelor's degree in business administration and Hebrew language and teaching methods from Al-Azhar University in Gaza, Palestine. He has been published in a wide range of publications, including Al Jazeera English, Palestine Square, Journal of Palestine Studies, Vox, and so on. He contributed to the anthology Gaza as Metaphor with a chapter entitled From Fence to Fence, Retelling Gaza's Story. Last but not least, he is the Education and Policy Coordinator at the Palestine Activism Program of American Friends Service Committee in Chicago. So a very warm welcome to you, Jihad.
Thank you so much, Abdul Razzaq. Appreciate the introduction and greetings to my fellow co-panelists, especially to Aya on the ground. I'm really honored to join you all today and to talk about Gaza, which is always a timely topic. Of course, I was asked to provide a little bit of context regarding Gaza in 12 minutes, which I will try my best to do. I believe that this context is important, especially when it comes to Gaza, for multiple reasons, but most importantly, because the ongoing crisis and crises that relate to Gaza and their intensity, especially, in recent years, sometimes make people. Let me try. Apologize about the.
Yeah, sorry, Jihad. Yeah. I asked you to adjust the mic. Yeah.
Can you hear me better now?
Oh, much better.
Okay.
Much better.
Apologies about that. As I said, I was asked to provide a brief context regarding how can we understand Gaza today, and I think this context is very important because when we think about Gaza today, sometimes people make the intentional or unintentional mistake of not taking into consideration this context, and I think especially the history, that has unfolded before and especially after the 1948 Nakba, the catastrophe that befell the Palestinian people in 1948 as a direct result of the violent establishment of the State of Israel then. And the entire Palestinian experience has been affected by that colossal event, the establishment of Israel at the expense of Palestinian independence, of Palestinian land, of Palestinian, nationhood, and so on and so forth. And this framework of centering 1948 as the central event through which we understand the Palestinian experience and the plight of the Palestinian people and the decades of resistance, the decades of bloodshed, and everything that has unfolded since 1948, we cannot understand any of these things without understanding the Nakba and how it affected Palestinian life. And when it comes to Gaza, the Nakba is incredibly relevant. It's very important in understanding Gaza today. To help provide this context, I'm going to talk about a number of central elements that can help us understand Gaza. And of course, I will not be able to talk in detail about each one, but I hope to offer the audience some sort of a roadmap that could guide them in understanding Gaza and in making sense of how things got to be the way they are today. So in understanding Gaza, it is important to think about the pre-1948 context. That is the British Mandate and the moment Palestine fell under British occupation. And that happened after British forces completely destroyed Gaza City, the historic Gaza City, and flattened most of its quarters and buildings and infrastructure. And up until the 40s, Palestinians in Gaza kept advocating for better resources and for the reconstruction of their city and the rebuilding of their city. Because during the mandate, due to the almost, no proximity to Zionist settlement, British mandate investment and development was pretty far away from Gaza. And additionally, the Palestinians in Gaza used civil disobedience to resist British authorities. So that made them, and of course, in addition, alongside many other Palestinian communities, but that made them pretty marginalized in economically and in terms of infrastructure and development. And then comes 1948, where the year in which this entity that we call today, this geographic entity, this geographic space that we call today the Gaza Strip was formed, not due to natural factors or due to administrative changes that happened in the country, but as a result of a man-made war, man-made conquest. So the Gaza district, which was one of Mandate Palestine and Ottoman Palestine, Palestine's largest administrative regions, would be reduced into what is today the Gaza Strip, a small strip of land with the area of 140 square miles, 365 square kilometers. And as part of that process, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from the former Gaza district and from other parts of Palestine will be pushed to the southwest by Israeli forces and Zionist militias, to be concentrated, to be pushed towards this newly established strip of land, which in the minds of people then was supposed to be a temporary refuge until they're able to go back to their towns and villages, some of which are within walking distance from what is today the Gaza Strip. But after 1948 and after Israel was established, Israel made sure to prevent Palestinian attempts to return. And that happened through a very bloody and violent process where Israel created a long list of security measures and passed laws in the Knesset considering any Palestinian attempt to return home an act of infiltration that is punishable by violence. And so this was important because then for Palestinians in Gaza, 70% of whom were refugees, and most of whom could see their homes, towns, and villages and own property in what is today the state of Israel, for whom that was the issue, that was the big question. Those were people who were kicked out from their homes, towns, and villages and wanted to go home. And since 1948, this has been a central theme, regardless of what political parties exist, regardless of what chapter of Palestinian history Palestinians have experienced and went through. It's been the question of going home. People, refugees who were kicked out from their homes, towns, and villages and wanted to go home. Now, after 1948, the Gaza Strip became, like other parts of Palestine, became an important space for Palestinian nationalism, for Palestinians to, resist attempts to resettle them somewhere else, to erase the right of return, to erase their national cause. And as a result of that, Palestinians in Gaza, even inside Gaza, would continue to be punished by Israel and its allies. So comes the year 1967, and to add insult to the injuries of history, what Israel did after 1967, even though the total area of the Gaza Strip represented only 1% of the entire area of historic Palestine, which includes today what is the state of Israel and the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, Israel built settlements on 1/3 of the area of the Gaza Strip and settled thousands of Israeli settlers there who exploited Gaza's environment, Gaza's natural resources, fresh water reservoir, most fertile lands. And this led to another element that is important in understanding Gaza, the economic de-development of the Gaza Strip. So Israel prevented Palestinians inside Gaza from benefiting from the very limited natural resources, land, water that they had access to. And of course, under Israel's occupation, Israel did not invest meaningfully or in any way in building infrastructure and improving life. And it only allowed Palestinians to work in Israel, but they only worked in professions that responded to the needs of the Israeli market, and nothing that contributed meaningfully to Palestinian economic development. That led to another element, that is the first Intifada, which started in the Gaza Strip. And, I'm sure most of the audience here know about the first Intifada. I won't dwell on that, but as a response to the first Intifada and how it hurt Israel's reputation worldwide and how it exposed the occupation, Israel launched a series of closure policies and intensified already existing policies in place that were meant to prevent Palestinians from Gaza, Palestinians from the West Bank, from traveling and crossing into each other's part of Palestine. And these closure policies would remain actually in effect even during the Oslo process, which is another important element in understanding Gaza. The Oslo process actually intensified the physical and political fragmentation of the Palestinian people. And it led to the fragmentation of Palestinian body politic because it was a so-called peace process that was imposed from the outside and that was meant to enable a group of Palestinians to police other groups of Palestinians and to impose what Aya described, the two-state framework, which fails to address any root cause of why Palestinians suffer today. And all of this then would culminate in the final element I will talk about today, which is the blockade since 2007, which if we look at this history in a broader sense, then we only can see the blockade since 2007 as yet another chapter of this long history of physical, economic, and political isolation and fragmentation of Palestinian life, including Gaza. But because Gaza has showed a high degree of capacity in resisting Israel's policies and Israel's attempts to erase Palestinians politically and to basically end the Palestinian struggle for liberation and nationhood. Gaza has been punished severely since 2007. So I think, and the blockade that has been in place since then, which has worsened, which created a situation that the UN more than 10 years ago described as quote unquote unlivable. This is something that I think its continuation until today, and how it has been tolerated by the international community and how it's been normalized. This signals a very dangerous precedent in our world today, and in how governments and states are unable to treat people in such manner. I'm sure my colleagues here will talk more about the blockade and its logic and how it continues and how it affects Palestinians in Gaza. But I believe it is important for any person who's interested in understanding Gaza to go back to this history and understand it, because this history is not just history that is relegated to the past. It's rather present, that these are things that people live and experience their consequences today. So I hope I provided a brief context that can help people think about Gaza better. And of course, I'm more than happy to answer any questions in the Q&A segment. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Jihad. And I think that what you've pointed out to, the context is essential to understand, because this is obviously a siege and a blockade that is completely man-made. It is, of course, imposed by the Israeli state, but there's a lot of collusion that goes on with this siege. It's quite unprecedented in the sense that this is not just a colonial power besieging a native population that it had cut off from its compatriots and that it had cut off from the rest of the world. This is also a lot of governments that claim to represent the so-called international community being complacent with it and supporting this effort. So we've had situations before where colonial authorities suppressed and besieged a population, but it's been a long time since we've seen this level of collusion and support for that. And the arguments used to support this situation are always far from being sober. There is no serious political discussion, in fact, of what is going on. It's all reduced to this idea that Gaza is ruled by a terrorist government, and nobody questions what does that mean. I mean, by this definition, Israel is ruled by a far more terrorist government, not just because of its current actions, but because the current political parties are all offshoots of an officially terrorist movement, unlike Hamas, for example, which does not officially proclaim itself as such. The Israeli governments of today are a continuation of a current that was created by Menachem Begin. And you have to read his memoirs. He celebrates being a terrorist and carrying out terrorist operations. He got celebrated and invited to all sorts of international venues, and there's programs named after him in this country. So this is very political, but there's very little sobriety around it, because there's an attempt to criminalize thought. There's an attempt to besiege thought in this case, and that's what strikes me as an academic. As much as Gaza is besieged and blockaded, our minds are besieged and blockaded around it. And to break that siege, it is a great honor for me today to introduce a dear friend and a truly wonderful scholar who has studied questions of tunnels and questions of geology and questions that are absolutely fascinating when we look at issues like that of Gaza. Dr. Hadi Al-Asali is a postdoctoral research scholar and lecturer in Earth and Environmental Sciences at Columbia University in New York. She holds a PhD from Columbia University and was an ACLS Emerging Voices postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. She is an anthropologist and former engineer whose work looks at the ongoing colonial legacies of the discipline of geology, as well as anti-colonial ways of knowing and relating to the earth in Gaza and other parts of southern Palestine. It's a true honor to welcome you today, Hadeel, and please share with us your thoughts.
Thank you, Abid, and thank you to everyone for being here. It's nice to see so many familiar faces and to meet new ones that are thinking collectively about this very unfortunate commemoration. وتحياتي بالذات لأهل غزة اللي عايشين الحصار. I want to begin with a quote from 2008 by Ghassan Haj, a Lebanese anthropologist based in Australia, who wrote in response to Operation Cast Lead, which was one of the early bombardments of Gaza in 2008 that killed nearly 1,500 Palestinians. There was a debate that happened at the time in Australia about was it a war or was it a one-sided massacre? And in his essay on narcissistic victimhood, he described the difficulty he has speaking about Gaza in academic terms with any sort of subtlety, a difficulty that I also share. And I quote him, "Gaza is in a permanent state of criminality. It's not what happens in Gaza, it's not the invasion of Gaza, it's not an event in Gaza. Gaza itself is a permanent state of criminality. I cannot be more subtle about it. Indeed, I think it is one of these situations where more subtlety or more balance or more fairness is simply unethical." End quote. In other words, it's not a matter up for debate. Of course, we here understand this, that it's not just the bombardments or the siege of Gaza that are criminal, but the very creation of the Gaza Strip, which Jihad described earlier from its inception as a territorial entity in 48-49 when the armistice lines were drawn, and the conditions it has been held in ever since. In 2006, soon after Operation Summer Rains, one of the earliest bombardment of Gaza around the time of the siege, I gathered a testimony from a relative in Gaza City, which I edited over some visuals, and let me just share my screen, into a short film called Dagit Gaza. So I recorded him in 2006. I released the film in 2008. It's just a short little film after Operation Cast Lead. And the sad thing is one could not tell the difference if it was 2006 or 2008. And even more tragic is that his testimony continues to be relevant as if it could have been recorded today. I gathered more testimonies from the family of a friend on the difficulties of daily life there now, which I'll share at the end if I have time. However, since we are here speaking in this forum, the Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs, and since Aya brought up the important point of the fact that we are here, those of us here in the United States have a big responsibility here, I thought it might be appropriate to lay out 3 actions that those of us here could take to help break the siege on Gaza. After all, part of the mission of the Watson Institute is to, quote, promote peace through international relations and research policy. The first has to do with this quote on the screen now, which was from my relative. This is a still from the film that I described, and he's saying that America, meaning the United States, is empowering Israel. In 2014, during Operation Protective Edge, another relative called and asked why Obama was sending more weapons to Israel while it was slaughtering Palestinians. In other words, what can be done about this country's policies that are enabling what's happening there? Part of the premise for Israel's attacks on Gaza is an extension of the war on terror, which Abid just brought up, or more generally, the terrorism discourse. So for this reason, one action I'm calling for is for the Watson Institute and other institutions that have impacts on government policies to revive the anti-war movement, in particular this war on terror, which Gaza has fallen victim to in more ways than one. I'd like to share another screen. Okay. So one way that this has happened, that this war on terror has affected Gaza, is the US State Department's list of designated foreign terrorist organizations, which has every single Palestinian group listed on it. But of course, as Abed mentioned earlier, not the Israeli military. And here you can see the PFLP, PLF, you can see Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and you even have Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades, which is the military wing of Fatah. So basically, every engagement with Palestinian groups is stunted by this designation as terrorists, which has added another layer to the siege on Gaza, making it very difficult to engage with what's actually happening on the ground. Anyone affiliated with these groups or even suspected of it has been criminalized not only in Israel, but even here in the United States. And this poses a huge risk for those of us who have relations there. All electronic communications in and out of Gaza are monitored by Israel. You could read the work of Helga Tawil Sudi on this, which is wonderful, on the digital blockade. So thus, the first course of action I'm suggesting for ending the siege is to abolish the war on terror and the US State Department's list of foreign terrorist organizations, which has had horrific implications for places besides Palestine, such as Iraq and Afghanistan. The second issue I would like to raise is the importance of highlighting the role of Egypt on the siege of Gaza. Gaza's relationship with Egypt is a complicated one. On the one hand, we love Egypt. I love Egypt, you know, we identify with it culturally, and elders I've interviewed admonished me when I called the period of Egypt's rule over Gaza an occupation. There is a sense of shared Arab identity, which makes the mistreatment of Palestinians from Gaza by Egypt even more painful. I've experienced Egypt both ways, both as a stateless refugee, I was not allowed in, and as a US citizen, when it felt like red carpets were being rolled out everywhere. Palestinians without Western passports who want to travel in and out of Gaza are essentially held in detention conditions during their entire journey between Cairo's airport and Rafah. Furthermore, speaking of Rafah, which is a Palestinian city that was split by the border, Egypt waged its own war on terror after 2014 on North Sinai. The Egyptian side of Rafah, which is a Palestinian population, so the Egyptian side of Rafah was completely flattened and its population displaced. And these Palestinians happen to be very far from the Palestinian imaginary because of these imposed borders. However, I have spent time with them doing my research. In 2014, they told me, we just watched the war on Gaza. Now Gaza is watching the war on us. It has to be said that, you know, for those of us that are from Gaza, to speak out against Egypt is quite risky because this poses, because Egypt has its fair share of human rights abuses against its own populations, let alone those that, like Palestinians, who become scapegoats for Egypt's problems. I was struck by an image of graffiti in Cairo during the 2021 war on Gaza and the Sheikh Jarrah incidents in Jerusalem. The graffiti said, "We are sorry, Palestine, but we are also under occupation." Egypt has long been the second largest recipient of US funding after Israel, with the current Ukraine funding aside. And so again, I think institutions like this should be playing a lead role in highlighting not only these human rights abuses, but also further reasons to abolish the war on terror and the terror state list. And I think that an anti-war movement here that needs to be revived could play a pivotal role in abolishing it. The third point I would like to make is something I've written and spoken about in different forums, and that is for all of us to do more in terms of those of us that are committed to Palestinian studies, to alleviate the marginalization of Gaza within Palestine studies. Gaza is more than a humanitarian case. Geographically, it extends well beyond the confines of the Gaza Strip, and it contains multiple universities, research centers, and independent scholars who are more than mere sources of testimony, but are the best analysts of the conditions of Gaza, and by extension, Palestine and the region. More can and should be done to bring Gaza's intellectual worlds into the fold of Palestine studies at an institutional level. And finally, I'll end with just a brief excerpt of a more recent testimony from a friend's family in the Shuja'iyya neighborhood, which is unfortunately focused on the difficulties of daily life, which we're hearing a lot about today. But I just want to say a few words to honor the time that they gave me. She began, what can we say to cover what goes on here? Nothing in Gaza has been unaffected. Every family has somebody maimed or martyred. Universities and schools are bombed. The situation in Gaza is very bad. Every time we rebuild, they destroy. Also, do not forget our conditions with basic necessities like water and power, which are often cut off. This is also affecting our daily lives. Even the water that we do get is no good, even though we pay for it. It's brackish and causes us problems, and so we have to buy bottled water. The food in the refrigerator is constantly going bad because of the power cuts, and the goods we do get here are expensive and poor quality. This testimony goes on for a very long time, and I ended up feeling quite guilty that I was asking for this, because how many more testimonies do we need? So I'd just like to end with, the 3 points that I brought up, especially the need for a revival of the anti-war movement and an abolition of the war on terror and the State Department's terror watch list. And thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Hadil. And I really appreciate the fact that you combined in your talk the political context, the intellectual dimension, as well as the reality on the ground. And I think we really need to operate on all 3 levels in order to solve this current disaster, which, by the way, I think all the talks have highlighted the fact that this situation cannot be solved without an overall anti-colonial vision around what is happening in Palestine as a whole and within the Israeli state itself. Because Gaza, as several people have highlighted in this panel, is actually a concentration of the entirety of southern Palestine. It is a byproduct of the theft, actually, of large areas of land from places like Isdud, from places like Majd al-Asqalan, from places like Bir al-Saba and the entirety of the Naqab desert. Gaza district was the largest in Palestine, actually, as you had noted. And a lot of refugees from Palestine ended up there, only to be cornered for many decades. And this current siege is just a continuation of a previous policy, but in much more severe form than ever before. So we need to look at the politics of it. We need to look, as Hadil said, at all these frameworks that prevent us from addressing the situation. And one of them is certainly the war on terror. So I really appreciate your intervention, Hadil. And now it is a great honor to introduce Dr. Sui Chayang. Now, Dr. Sui is, I've known Dr. Sui the longest out of all the people on this panel. And I've been inspired by her all my life, actually. She's somebody who encountered the Palestinian cause in 1982 during the very difficult siege of Beirut, which we cannot help but actually draw some parallels between what happened in Beirut and what happened in Gaza, although what happened in Beirut was a very concentrated phenomena, an attack that lasted for 2 months. But what took place in Gaza now is an extended replay of that. Dr. Sui has, since the siege of Beirut, since serving there, since witnessing all the massacres that happened there, including Sabra and Shatila, which we're marking its 40th anniversary this year, has continued to be involved in the Palestinian cause in very profound ways. She's an orthopedic surgeon. She was a leading orthopedic surgeon in London, and was the first female orthopedic surgeon to reach the level that she did in her major hospital there, and continued to serve in the medical community in Palestine in very profound ways. When I asked her to come with us today, I hadn't realized that she was going through a very difficult medical situation of her own, which she will describe. But what struck me was that she decided to come anyways, and that's the way that I've known Sui all along. whenever there's an opportunity to speak on the situation that she knows so well, that she's lived for so long, that she's contributed so much to, she does not waste the opportunity. And I am very honored to introduce her today. I am always touched when I hear her speak, and I think you'll all feel her magic right now. So Dr. Sui, are you there?
I think we can start sharing screen now, Barbara. Okay, and I call this the wounds of Gaza, because when I was actually in Gaza with Kaslet, what I was writing a piece called The Wounds of Gaza, and I don't know where it started, where it began. The wounds of Gaza are so deep, so multi-layered, and the suffering is so great that it is just impossible for me to begin. And the other thing is I'm also not able to advance the screen. So if we just run it forwards, Barbara, yeah. So that's me. And then the next slide. Okay, just to remind us that that was Palestine. And then Palestine became smaller and smaller and smaller, with more and more people living in a very small land. And Gaza is part of Palestine. And despite being under siege and being excluded, Gaza does great things, as we see in a minute. Okay, next slide, please. This is Gaza, blockaded by land, air, and sea, home to 2.3 million people now. Next slide. So the first Intifada brought me to Gaza. I left Lebanon, where I was working with Palestinians in refugee camps, when I was asked whether I'd go to Gaza and start a trauma service. And you can remember that time, all these people, 66,000 wounded, 120,000 taken to prison, including half of them children. And of all things, you can find it in Encyclopedia Britannica. Next slide. So Eretz, you're familiar with. Next slide, please. So once inside Gaza, you meet real people, not victims, but heroes. And that means so much to me because, you know, you hear about the wounds, the pain, the suffering, but once you're in there, you realize that people in Gaza give you hope. These are the women and children of Gaza during the first Intifada, unarmed, confronting the fourth largest military force, basically standing against them, blocking the tanks, and getting themselves arrested and beaten. Next slide, please. And you find that I actually end up working in a Christian hospital. That time, Gaza has been under occupation for 21 years. The Egyptians built 7 hospitals, which all came under Israeli occupation. The Christian hospital did not. So that was the only place where it's safe to treat people who felt that somehow they are not under the scrutiny of the Israeli army. Next slide. And you find that Gaza have no shortage of doctors. But if you realize that these doctors that worked with me or I with them in 1988 has no chance to further their training, some has never left Gaza, continuing to serve their people war after war and watching their families murdered, and yet being steadfast and resilient. You will know what it means to be a doctor in Gaza. And I admire them unashamedly. Next slide, please. And of course, during that time, the world was scandalized because for the first time, the television showed Israeli army arresting Palestinians and deliberately beating them up and breaking their limbs. It is called a policy of breaking their bones. Next slide. And people died. This boy was shot with a plastic bullet, point blank. Next one. Next slide. This young man was shot with a rubber bullet. Next slide. And for the first time, people understood that Palestinians were not terrorists. They were refugees. They were people who have been robbed of their justice and who have suffered and have been hidden from the world. This is Jabalia camp, the largest refugee camp in Gaza. Next slide. You can see the open stores in Jabalia. Next slide. But when you actually look at it, you look at the faces of Palestinian people. This is after a 30-day-long curfew where they are not allowed to go and buy food. There they are queuing to get the food rations. And you can see the faces of the Palestinian people, kind, sad, and gentle. No hatred, completely human. Next slide. And you also see the beautiful children of Gaza. These are the Intifada babies. Many of the girls who have grown up now, they would have been kind of 40 years old, 45 years old, and bringing up their own children. Next slide. And these are the so-called, control of riots. You call them rubber bullet, but actually they're just metal balls. And if they're fired straight into someone's head, you just die, fracture skull. Plastic bullets are 70% metal as well. Tear gas made in Pennsylvania, fired liberally in schools, into hospital, 4 or 5 canisters at a time, causing those injuries. Next one. But on the other hand, there's also the beauty of Gaza. All the time I was writing this chapter called The Wounds of Gaza, I just cannot think of except the beauty of Gaza. This is the coast of Gaza with the white sands. Next slide. And the sunset of Gaza. I took this after Kaslet, and you can see how beautiful Gaza is. Still is, despite whatever happened. Next slide. And you can also see the springtime in Gaza, beautiful blossoms. But right under this tree in our hospital, 343 Palestinians were shot by the Israeli army and 6 died. They call it the Day of Blood. Next slide. Gaza used to be the fruit and vegetable basket of the whole Middle East. This family has been planting fruits and citrus for generations. They made the desert bloom. Gaza was never a desert. It was fertile. And Jabalia was one of the most fertile parts in the world. If you Google the history of Jabalia camp. Next slide. Yeah, the dates, the palms. Next one. The gardens. Next one. But for those young people that were watching this, you'll find that we remember Gaza through the series of wars that happened to Gaza. I won't call it a war because it's just a military assault where the Israeli planes fly over and bomb Gaza and kill many people, firing from their tanks and shooting from their warships. And Kaslet, when we talk about Kaslet, this was it. Right. Next slide. Gaza was very crowded. So if you actually shoot a missile to take out one terrorist, you'll find that the collateral damage is incredible. You take out the whole neighborhood and kill many people. Next slide. So that was Kaslet. That's phosphorus, fired liberally. Next one, we can go fast because it's all about damage. Okay, this is Kaslet. And it was Christmas when that happened. Next one. Next one. Next one. So when I learned about Kaslet, I immediately stopped all work in my British hospital and flew in and made my way across Rafah. And when I arrived, the northern half of Gaza has been destroyed. It is especially difficult when you look at this scene because, once upon a time, there were orchards, there were factories, there were schools, bombed flat. So run through the next few slides. It's all about damage in Kaslet. Yeah, buildings, next one. Next one. Next one. Next one. Next one. Big bombs, okay? You're talking each of these bombs, maybe 1,000 kg or more. Next one. Fuel air explosive. This is especially horrible because they call it vacuum bombs. They just suck in a multi-story building, burying everybody alive. Next one. Silent bombs. We still don't know what it is. And if I say anything, they'll call me a conspiracist. But basically, it's a very quiet bomb. and it melt all the concrete. We don't know what it is. Only the Israeli army knows. Next one. And of course, the human cost. The first day of Qasilat, 50 of these police cadets who are actually graduating were killed on the spot. Next one. Targeting of hospitals. Now, this is not a Hamas hospital. This is Palestine Hospital. It was built by the Palestine Red Crescent Society. It was administered by Fatah. So I don't know why they hit it and burnt it with phosphorus. Below is the one and only rehabilitation hospital in Gaza, also destroyed. Next one. Ambulance. Targeting on ambulance. Next one. Schools. Many schools are hit and destroyed. Next one. Including the famous American school, which has been hit 4 times, bombed 4 times. Next one. Targeting of UN compounds, because UN is where everybody hid, thinking that it will be safe. Next one. And you can see that was hit by phosphorus shells. Many people burned alive. Next one. Phosphorus is especially nasty. I want to show you the wounds. It just burns right to the bone. And only when it burns all the fluid in that particular wound will it stop burning. This from Lancet. Next one. New kind of explosive which neatly amputated someone's limb, both sides. Next one. And Shifa Hospital, operating under extremely difficult circumstances. The doctors, the nurses, the surgeons, trying to save the lives of people while at the same time receiving news that their own family have been hurt and killed. Next one. Shifa, next one. The mortuary of Shifa, next one. Killing children, next one. Yeah, this is terrible. It's just burnt alive. Next one. Next slide. Whole families killed. Next one. So even before they could recover from the wounds of Qasilat, you have a bigger and nastier bombardment. And I don't know what to call it. It's not a war. It is a military assault on a civilian population that has got no bomb shelters, very little means of defense, and just killing them. 18,000 homes destroyed, last sentence, which means 1 million people were made homeless. And some of the children, 10%, permanently disabled. They are still struggling with their disability, plus those from Qasilat. Next one. Next one. I tried to get in because the Palestinian doctors wanted me there, but I was put in prison and deported by the Israelis. Next one. That winter was horrible. So many people were homeless, living in this kind of tents in the rain. Next one. But I want to leave you this. These are Palestinian women sitting on a heap of rubble, telling me that we are Palestinians. We are strong. We not only build, but we rebuild. Next one. So soon afterwards, 2 years afterwards, USA elected Donald Trump. And the siege of Gaza tightened and the condition deteriorate. Gaza has no hope. And there's also a siege on publicity. People in Gaza cannot get their stories out. They might be able to do it on social media, but the mainstream press of the Western world just have a news blockade. So what do people do in Gaza? Next slide. Right. Just now, Jihad mentioned about people in Gaza being refugees, and they can actually just walk to their ancestral home. Like Abu Muhammad down here. He looks after the hospital. He's the gatekeeper of Ahli Hospital. One day he insisted I take him to his home because he thought that he can see his house. But when we arrived, it has already been destroyed and nearly a heap of rubble. You will know that for Abu Muhammad, Resolution 194, the right of return, means nothing at the moment because there's no home to return to. So when they're locked up like that, how would they send a message to people that we are here and we will take our destination into their own hands? Next slide. And that's why on the 30th of March, 2018, they launched the Great March of Return. In return for their audacity of confronting the Israeli army by demonstration inside Gaza, 100 Israeli snipers were stationed all around, and the policy is to maim. Not so much to kill, but to maim. So that what the aim of the first Intifada, to make them a nation of cripples, can be completed. So they shot deliberately to maim. Next slide. And this was the figures. I know it's too much for you to read that now, don't bother, but just know that 156 amputees and 7,996, which means nearly 8,000 live ammunition, more than 2,000 on children, and 1,200 whose limbs were shot with infection, which my colleagues are now going regularly out to Gaza to work with the Palestinian doctors to try and reconstruct. Paramedics were killed, health workers were wounded. Next slide. Israeli casualties. I put the reference down so that you can actually look up the actual articles. Next one. So these are the bullets that the snipers shoot. They're not ordinary bullets. They can reach about 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers. Next one. Shooting people when they're running away. You can, as a doctor, you can tell that this man is shot from the back because this was an exit wound. Next one. And special bullets, so that even if they don't strike bone to give the patient a fracture, they result in what's happened in the next slide. They just shred. You can see that this chap's bone is intact, but they just tore through all the muscles. They call it the butterfly bullets. Next one. So it was an especially horrible day on the 14th of May, 2018, when Trump officially opened the American embassy in Jerusalem. That day, 62 Palestinians in Gaza were shot dead. Our hearts were heavy, and we just don't know how things will pan out. My friends wrote to me a very horrible message saying it's all over now. People in Gaza are burying the dead. The hospitals are overwhelmed. There's not enough medicine, not enough blood, not enough anything. Next slide. I wrote this in return. We have seen Palestinians rise above every tragedy. We must continue to support and stand in solidarity with them. They build and they rebuild. They have strength, resilience, courage, and honor. And as friends, we have to be inspired by them and continue to journey on with them and not be afraid and faint-hearted. The dead will be buried. They'll find peace. The wounds will heal. The strength will return. The young will grow up and lead the struggle. It is not over until justice is restored. Not over till tyranny is defeated. Not over till Palestine is free and all can live in security and dignity. Next slide. Shortly after that, I was invited to go on board the Freedom Flotilla to Gaza. As you can see, I'm not exactly a spring chicken and I can't swim. I was very badly seasick. Next slide. Yet, it is my duty and the duty of all of us, whatever we can do, to do it. So I went on Auda, which is the boat of return, without realizing that 12 days later, 3 Israeli warships, 200 Navy commando, dozens of Soviets just stormed this boat and arrested all of us, kidnapped all our antibiotic supplies, which is meant for Gaza, and took us all to prison in Ashdod. This boat was supposed to be a gift to Gaza. In a literal sense, we are supposed to come as friends. It is such a small thing, yet to destroy hopes, not only for people in Gaza, but also for their friends who were taken to prison, and then from there, deported out of Gaza. Next picture. I returned home devastated because nobody wants to cover the story of the flotilla being captured and doctors being put in prison and stealing of all the medicine which is intended for Gaza and the kidnapping of the boat. Nobody wants to cover the story. Guardian covered the story, released by the Israelis. The terrorists who tried to infiltrate Gaza has been captured. But a few days after I arrived back in London, I received this, a beautiful dress made by the women in Gaza. And with it came a message: we'll give you our very best. Every stitch carries our history, our culture, our heritage, our struggle, our resilience. We will not be defeated. Next slide. So we have Jerusalem, Gaza, the events of May, which you heard about just now. So carry on. We know about what happened in Sheikh Jarrah. Carry on, next one. Next slide. Yeah, you know about East Jerusalem. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah, stop here. Gaza was under siege. Gaza wants to do something for Jerusalem. And I was shocked. I was watching all the footage of what happened in Al-Aqsa. And I was stunned when Gaza demanded the Israeli police withdrew by 6 p.m. Otherwise, 6 p.m. they didn't refuse. They refused to withdraw. And Gaza started firing rockets. Those rockets were just highly ineffective, 90% intercepted by the Iron Dome. So Israel launched. Next slide. Operation Guardians of War. Although it only last 11 days, it was particularly vicious because it was targeted against Gaza City, destroying hospitals, towers, business centers, children, and extended family, 20 of them wiped out. Next slide. Next slide. Among the buildings. I leave this with Abed and Barbara so that you can assess the figures. Some of it already published, so you won't be criticized. Next one. Next slide. Yeah, next slide. The dead. Okay, next slide. It was so horrible that even the New York Times published this on the front page. So you have made friends through the suffering and the death and the sacrifice of people in Gaza. Next one. Next slide, please. It continues. Breaking dawn. Next slide. Yeah. You can read this on your own. It is a long, long battle and a long, long tunnel. Next slide. Next slide. But I want to leave you with this. This was 1982. This was a photograph of a mass grave in Shatila camp immediately after the massacre. 1,000 to 1,700 bodies were buried there. Bulldozers came, soil was brought to cover the bodies, and white lime was sprinkled over them so that the bodies dissolved. All of us were heartbroken. We thought it was finished. Next slide. But when I came out on the main road, a group of Palestinian children met me. They put their arms around me And then they lined up and said, Dr. Aswi, take a picture of us. And while I was taking the picture, I realized that the children has put up their hands in the victory sign. We are not afraid. Let the Israelis come. Look at this picture. In the background were their homes, destroyed again. Homes which were repaired and destroyed and destroyed. In the foreground, not included in this picture, are bodies uncovered for identification. And the air is filled with the stench of decaying human flesh. But between death and destruction were the Palestinian children. They are our hope. The young Palestinians, they will do what's necessary and we will support them. They are defiant. They will claim their humanity no matter what the world says. Next slide. And to them, the children of Gaza. Next slide. The children of Gaza who drew this beautiful picture, so full of meaning. It's better than all the 100 slides I've shown you. And you can see in the picture, the collective memory of their trees being uprooted, the tanks coming in, helicopter firing at them. And yet they resist with burning tires, blocking them, and they look after the wounded. They are full of hope. They are the defense for Palestine, a humanitarian defense army. Next slide. And we know they make beautiful objects out of the colors of the Palestine flag. You know, this one made by disabled children in Khan Yunis. Next slide. And beautiful embroidery, which declares the Palestinian soul. Next slide. And I know the flowers of Palestine will always bloom. Next slide. I will leave you with this last slide. This is the Dome of the Rock, and just next to it is Al-Aqsa. And I think with this, I will tell you, no matter how destructive things can be for the Palestinians, there is always hope. And I look forward to the day when everybody in that piece of land can live together as brothers and sisters. The last 11 slides are all references and links, which I'll leave with you. If you have time, just look at them. You don't have to, but I end my talk here. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Swee, for this incredibly powerful talk. And I should note to the audience with us that you were there in all of these events. You go there whenever the people are besieged and attacked in Palestine and elsewhere. Dr. Swee, by the way, is also not just somebody who volunteers, but she created a whole infrastructure to deal with this situation. She was the founder of medical aid for Palestinians after she witnessed what happened in Sabra and Shatila in '82, and has worked so hard on alerting the medical community as well as policymakers and academics to the situation on the ground. So it is a true honor to have hosted you. I know that you wanted to talk a lot about the effects of the siege on cancer patients as a cancer survivor yourself, but we probably will have to do that some other time or during the Q&A.
Thank you.
But I just want to say, Dr. Swee, I know this is not very, this is not normally the space for this, but I truly, truly love and admire everything you do.
No, Abid. Palestine belongs to your generation.
Thank you. Now we move on to Dr. Fadi Zouda, who's a Palestinian American physician, a distinguished poet and translator, and he is the author of 5 collections of poetry. He's translated several other collections from the Arabic as well, and has been the co-editor and co-founder of the Tel Adnan Poetry Prize. He won numerous awards. I'm just going to mention a few. The Yale Series of Younger Poets Competition, which is really like a major award. He received the Arab American Book Award, the PEN Award, the Banipal Times Literary Supplements Prize from the UK, the Griffin Poetry Prize, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. He's also an editor-at-large for Milkweed Editions, and he's connected to Gaza in very intimate ways and knows it very, very well. So please, Dr. Fadi.
Thank you, Abed, and thank you, audience, and hello, Elora, and thank you, panelists. I will get going in a second. Let's see. So I'm gonna begin by reading a poem and then a text I wrote. Maybe I'll read a little fast, so forgive me. If stones were slingshots, if rockets could fly, I have seen the brimstones of the crushed, besieged, and mutilated rise up in the air. There, on the left bottom corner of your screen, you might miss their meager illumination like fireflies, their sluggish altitude, since on the right side of the screen, the hand of God has already lit up the sky with giant fireballs to swallow the embers released by the denizens of the hell he keeps them in. God, it's not your fault. Your right hand does not comprehend what your left doeth, and you don't like to be bothered in your eternal Big Bang. Goliath has not left the building alone. I am not waiting for David or Ulysses. My light is not for jarring. I am asked to speak a little about Gaza in the Western imaginary. So I'll speak with maybe a lack of nuance. In the Western imaginary, the siege of Gaza has become a vulgar Marvel movie or a comics series. The superhero is the Palestinian, the Gazan who is a superhero only by virtue of being a super victim, the innocent simpleton and debased civilian who acquires greater powers with each great tragedy that befalls them. Gaza, however, has not reached cult status in the humanitarian entertainment industry, because Gaza's affinity to the rest of the Palestinian world remains inseparably strong. And that is dangerous material for romantic solidarity. Although it does seem sometimes that the more we say Gaza, the less we say Palestine, as if Gaza is the subject of an experiment in which colonial Israel tears a people from themselves, yet again, a partition toward dismemberment, a brutal and cruel manufacture of a subpopulation to convince the political world that the people of Gaza are inessential to the rest of Palestine and Palestinians, yet superior to them in misfortune, thus worthy of greater compassion, and that is all. The people of Gaza are so aware of this that the writer Hussam Maruf expressed it in a poem as a counter manufacture. We manufacture spare hearts, lest we lose the hearts each of us has. This Gazan super victim, then, is a treasure trove for a Western humanitarian narrative divorced from and impotent to political resolution and intervention. The stories of the survivors, their ingenuity and adaptation becomes archives for studying a population that is not only subject to new weapons of war, but also subjects of social evolution. Gaza is the new model of how to break and break up a people in the 21st century. In the Western imaginary, Israeli practices are ultimately democratic practices of war. Only the Palestinian is a fixity, a rigidity between super victim and super villain. Yes, The supervillain in this vulgar Marvel series is neither Israel nor the US in the Western imaginary. The supervillain is also Palestinian. He is a bearded Muslim Gazan man who brings more misery on his people because his darkness is too violent, unintelligent, and underdeveloped. There is no denying that in Gaza, the US and Israel are villains, but they are not, to a Western majority audience, as villainous as a legitimate Palestinian resistance. This, of course, is a familiar racist vilification of victims through colonial methods that have secured the complicity of their populations. A Western imaginary cannot conceive of Gazans as living beings unless they are near death, unless they are that paradoxical word, Musliman, the word that describes the moribund of the Nazi concentration camps. And yet, it is the mere mention or echo of the concentration camps with regards to Gaza that offers comfort to a Western audience because Gaza is not yet a concentration camp. Gaza becomes little more than an intriguing spectacle, a contemporary postcard of lynching an entire population under the sterility of intervention, outside intervention. Solidarity with Gaza, as with the Palestinian question within the Western imaginary, is so steeply knotted up in anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, and anti-Palestinian prejudice. There is a well-known hadith by the Prophet Muhammad. If you see a wrongdoing, then try to rectify it with your hands. If you can't, then with your tongue. If you can't, then with your heart, though this is the feeblest faith. Hand, tongue, heart. Work, word, silence. Still, I do not think that much of the silent solidarity with Gaza in the West amounts to a feeble humanist faith. I argue that it is a conditioned complicity with a colonial brutality that only activates a moral heart when the Palestinian is destitute, near liquidation, and can only be kept alive through humanitarian gesture that calculates its risk-benefit ratio, its return on investment. There is no greater nemesis to love than indifference or the camouflage of indifference. In other words, there's a political economy, a capital of suffering that moves money, literature, and influence around to postpone the ultimate catastrophe, which is the irreversible disintegration of Palestinian society without means of centralized representation, an attritional genocide whose execution coaxes the Western public to tolerate it and participate in it. The Palestinians are to be resuscitated in perpetuity to prevent what the Western psyche considers the intolerable red line, a genocide through mass murder over a short duration. A horrific game or an abhorrent game of numbers. A disaster that is more difficult to mitigate through communicative capital and manipulation of public opinion. In English, Gaza becomes an epic drama whose catharsis dictates that the super victim superhero is phoenix-like and will not let the audience down. The supervillain, however, is a constant disappointment. I'd like to close with a quote from Rawan Hussein, a young woman poet from Gaza, as we spoke recently on the phone. The people of Gaza see themselves, these are her words, the people of Gaza see themselves as indomitable to the fullest meaning of the word. We can adapt to any difficulty we may face. Even when bullied or made submissive, we possess an astonishing capacity to remain psychologically strong within ourselves. It can be frightening to contemplate this capacity, even dangerous. The outside world pities us. It's true we deserve their pity. She chuckles as she says this, but it is hurtful to be pitied. None of this needed to happen. Why did we need to suffer this injustice, violence, and war in the first place? This pity towards us also means that others, no matter who and where they are, consider us inferior to them. Sometimes this is the case among Palestinians. Invariably, pity instills depravity in the one pitied, unless the latter assertively rejects that point of view from the former. We are not always the extremely feeble. We reject this view, and now and again we seek to alter it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zouda, for ending on these very, very powerful words and for your incredible presentation. I know we're running a little bit over the time allocated, but I do want to open up the space for some questions and answers. I should warn the audience that maybe Zoom will fail us in this process, and we might end up terminating, but we'll try our best to allow at least for 10 or 15 minutes of discussion. So if people want to ask, or if people have some thoughts, please go ahead. The way to do it would be to write in the Q&A section, and we'll take your question. I mean, I see a question from Karen Steele. Is there a way to get a copy of this powerful presentation we've had? Yes, it will be provided. But we also have a question. We have actually, this whole talk will be recorded, in fact, and disseminated. We have a question from Donald Pegler. I'm a survivor of the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty on June 8, 1967, the day before Israelis took the Golan. We have never been able to get our story into the official narrative. I appreciate your attempts to get the story of the people impacted by events. Do the people of Gaza know the survivor story of what happened to the USS Liberty? Hadil, do you wanna address that question?
I don't know if I know the answer to that question. Let me find it, about whether the people of Gaza know the survivor story. I don't know if they know that. I assume they would, because there is such a there's a very robust media and radio, and like I said, there's plenty of institutions of education that cover all kinds of nuanced parts of Palestinian history. But to answer whether or not they specifically know that story, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer.
Yeah, and I think the real issue is, I think what the question is really trying to ask also is if the people of Gaza know that there are alternative American worldviews as well about what is going on, and that even American experiences of Israeli violence are sometimes suppressed. So it sounds to me that that's where the question is heading. But we have other questions. There is a question from Hanan Hamad, Professor Hamad. Beyond what to do as an American, what to do as Arabs and citizens of states that have gone from being complicit with Israeli occupation to cooperative and supportive of Israeli aggression. Arab citizens have a lot to suffer, to pay attention to Palestinians and face repression for any form of opposition, even when they express solidarity with Palestinians or critique their regime's cooperation with Israel. Egypt is an example. Any thoughts on this from any of the panelists? It sounds like this is a question dealing with the complicity of the surrounding Arab region with what's going on in Gaza today.
I can say something quickly, since I brought it up in my comments about the role of Egypt specifically, and the risks that it poses for those of us that have both family there and expect to pass through there, to speak about what Egypt has done. But there's another question that I answered in the chat about Israel's role. I don't know if it's still there. About Israel's role and what happened in North Sinai, which is really an extension of Gaza. And it came out later that Sisi admitted that actually Israel was coordinating and doing airstrikes in North Sinai as well. So absolutely that, it's on the one hand, we can say that Arab citizens of these countries have a responsibility But as it was told to me in Egypt, actually now everyone is suffering a Nakba of their own in some sense. So it makes it a little difficult to put the onus on Arab people that are living under oppressive regimes. And that's why I tried to put the onus on us that are living here in this country, whose policies are enabling some of these regimes.
Okay. Dr. Sui, I have a question for you. You've just suffered through a very difficult medical situation, and at the same time, you had to deal with Palestinian women who are undergoing a similar situation in Gaza. But you were telling me about the difficulties of giving them the correct treatment given this siege. Can we talk a little bit about it? Because I know that we're trying to focus in this event on the political context, but I think it's very important to show that political discussions have implications for people's lives, and lives are affected in Gaza. Millions of lives are affected in Gaza every day by this cruel policy of siege and blockade. So please go ahead, Dr. Sweet.
Okay. You know, what's happening to Palestinian women with cancer is you know, to get breast cancer is terrible for anybody, okay? But for the Palestinian women in Gaza, it's especially difficult because cancer affects a lot of younger women who are mothers. So if they have a disease, first of all, you know, there's no way they can be treated. In the past, at least they can have an operation, take the cancer and the breast out. But with successive siege and the hospital being overwhelmed with casualties, with no medicine and so on, the cancer surgery get delayed. And also the medicines that are needed, for instance, chemotherapy, they are very complicated and expensive, and it's hard to get hold of in Gaza. Sometimes it's not available. The other mainstay of treatment for cancer, not only breast cancer, but any kind of cancer, is radiotherapy. Now, the radiotherapy is not allowed in Gaza because I don't know, it's just prohibited. Now, then with the siege, the women cannot get out for treatment. So ever since the siege started, the mortality, that means the death of women in Gaza suffering cancer, is double that of Israel, double that of the rest of the world. So it's that bad. So the same will be true for other things. You see, like for instance, if someone needs to go out to Egypt or Jerusalem and a permit is not granted, and in time-sensitive illness like Gaza, they just die. I would be dead if I have this kind of Gaza, or this kind of cancer living in Gaza under their circumstances. I should be dead. Won't be talking to you here. So it's as serious as that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sui. And I know you've been involved very much in trying to coordinate some supplies, but it's very difficult. As you mentioned, even radiotherapy equipment is almost impossible to get there due to the Israeli restrictions. They are impossible to get there, in fact. And there's a whole range of other medicines that have that situation. Now, there is an important question that we received, and I think it's very significant because it's a question about the grounds for the Israeli siege of Gaza. What are these grounds? Is there somebody that would like to address that question?
I will answer only part of it because I think that it's complicated, but in the sense that there are many factors, but I do think that we have to reach a point to accept from a public standpoint that Israeli violence is so fixated on the destruction of Palestinian collective and identity. There is just a hateful, horrific madness under all various pretexts of security and whatnot. But it really is about destroying Palestinian society, almost as I said, to an irreversible state where the Palestinians continually struggle to effectively and actively call themselves a people with centralized representation to move forward toward a meaningful liberation. So that's one part of the answer, and I'm sure others have more nuanced or grounded replies.
I mean, if we want to answer it just in a literal sense, the Israeli claim is Gaza is ruled by a terrorist organization. Therefore, it needs to be cut off from the world until that rule is ended. Now, of course, I don't agree with any of these grounds, but I was wondering if people on the panel have some reflections on that. Jihad, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like this point, it's usually brought up not in good faith. I'm not referring to the question from the audience, of course, but when pro-Israel supporters, when Zionists, and those who wish to justify Israeli policies use this argument, the reason why I counted the central elements in understanding Gaza's trajectory and how Gaza ended up in the situation that it's in today earlier was to say that this is a process that started a long time ago and still continues. It started with the Nakba. It started in 1956 when Israel occupied the Gaza Strip, and 1% of the Gaza Strip's population was either killed, injured, or arrested. It started in 67 when Israel planted settlements in an already economically disadvantaged Gaza Strip. It started under Israel's decades of occupation as Israel continuously de-developed and destroyed and continues to destroy Palestinian life in all of its aspects. So if you know, Israel supporters can talk about Hamas as the justification, that's fine, that's their prerogative. But like at the end of the day, it is important for us as advocates, as people who want to change things on the ground, to realize that this is a process that predates Hamas. Hamas was founded in 1987. It's a process that is linked to a broader project of erasure, a project of denying millions of Palestinians their rights, their self-determination, and their right to thrive and live in dignity in their country and in their homeland. You know, and at the end of the day, like as we see, you know, even an organization like Hamas changes its charter, you know, tries to appeal to the language of international law and international legitimacy, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, as you said, Abdul Razak, we see far-right Israeli groups and organizations and parties that are voted into the Knesset, and they join coalitions in Israeli governments, and no one from the international community questions the fact that these forces exist in Israel and are allowed into the halls of power and to, you know, make decisions that affect people's lives. So I think this is a question of double standards. It's a question of, you know, deflection, the use of justifications to continue with this project. And and of course also it's a question of talking about the symptoms of decades of occupation and injustice, and then use these symptoms as a justification to continue this occupation and this injustice. So I think this is all about what kind of a discourse are we having and what needs to be changed, and how Palestinians are talked about, and whether it is acceptable for us and for everyone else to normalize the collective punishment of millions of people destroying their lives because of an electoral vote they made in 2006 or something like that. So I think this is very important. For all of these things are important to think about when it comes to this question.
Well, I want to take it from there as a historian, actually, and I want to note that there's a long history of trying to control Palestinians and to justify that control by means of delegitimizing their leaderships, okay, and delegitimizing their political movements. In this case, of course, Hamas is a movement that does exist in Palestine, as does the Muslim Brotherhood exist in other parts of the Arab world. It is one component out of many in Palestinian society. It engaged in the certain tactics which entailed suicide bombings for a short period of time in its existence, actually, in its short existence. So from we saw some operations in the late 90s, and we saw some operations during the Second Intifada. These were mainly tactical. It was a tactic that was followed in that period. It is not the overall strategy of the organization, and we know that it hasn't engaged in any of these acts since then. And as you said, Jihad, it has adjusted its policies in many ways. Now, we've seen this before in other places in Northern Ireland. Often, when the British governments did not want to deal with the real questions on the ground, they wanted to just delegitimize the fact that there is the colonial dimension to what is going on. They tell you there is no point in talking to Sinn Féin. They are a terrorist organization. They are terrorist representatives. And this is a striking example of that. And of course, today, we can't think of a situation or a solution in a place like Ireland without having Sinn Féin involved, because it is an important component of the situation on the ground. I think in Palestine, the siege that you, Jihad, and others on this panel, the siege that you've been trying to break, the intellectual siege, the political siege on discussing this issue, has really impacted the way we think about these things. And I'm really glad that we were able in this panel to open up some space for discussion on this issue, which we barely hear about in the news, and we certainly don't hear discussed enough in academic and political institutions. So it was a true joy and a pleasure. I know there were a couple of questions for Hadil, but I just got an alert that we do have to wrap up now. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Barbara has put in the chat box a link to the website in which the talk will be disseminated, and we look forward to seeing you in our future events that are supported by the Mahmoud Darwish Chair and that are hosted by the Palestinian Studies Program here at Brown. Thank you so much, everyone.